My husband's ex made him believe that I was pregnant with my stepbrother's child, so he asked me for a divorce or an abortion. But after 10 years, he now wants to see his child, and I have bad news for him. My husband's ex completely manipulated him into believing that I was cheating on him, but it gets much worse. She convinced him that the person I supposedly cheated with was my stepbrother and that I was pregnant with his child. I would never be unfaithful to him, let alone with my stepbrother. He didn't believe me, so I ended up leaving him. But now he wants to see his child. For reference, and also for me because I'm not going to use real names here and want to keep track of the fake names I choose, the people involved in this story are as follows. Me, 35 years old. Grant, 38, my current husband. Sebastian, my stepbrother. Ezra, my ex-husband. And Cassie, in her 30s, Ezra's ex-wife before we met. I don't know her exact age. I'll try to keep this as clear as possible, but this is a mix of seeking advice with anxiety and venting anger that I don't want to take out on anyone else. So, even if you're just here to read about the horrible lives of strangers and aren't going to leave any advice, feel free to read. I hope I can do justice to summarizing one of the worst times of my life. Before I get too sidetracked with background information, here's a summary of the current situation. I just found out that my ex-husband has been asking about me after almost a decade of silence because he wants to see me and my child. It might not seem like a big deal when written in one sentence, but I hope as you continue reading you'll understand why this news has caused such an emotional upheaval. When I was 24 years old, my best friend and I moved across the country to a new city and state to start our adult lives. 6 months later, she was offered her dream job in our hometown, and of course, I encouraged her to take it. Unfortunately, that meant I was left alone in a new city and state. 2 weeks after she left, I met Ezra. I was alone without friends and stressed from my new job. He had just broken up with his high school girlfriend, and all of that combined to form a very intense relationship. A few weeks after meeting, he was practically living in my apartment, and I was convinced he was the love of my life. He was in his last semester of college after changing majors several times and was ready to start working at his father's engineering company half an hour away from the city. Maybe I was starting to see a future in that city. Now, looking back, the cracks were evident from the beginning. Hindsight is much clearer than foresight, and so when his graduation arrived and his ex-girlfriend showed up with his mother, I simply smiled, introduced myself, and tried to make a good impression on his family. Cassie was practically a family friend, which was expected considering how long they had been together before the breakup. But she was basically the classic girl next door. Their mothers were best friends, so they grew up together, and I was told that the day they started dating was the best day of Ezra's mother's life. Still, I was young, naive, and in love, so I put up with it, sat next to her, and did everything I could to get along with his mother. She never fully accepted me, but I never stopped trying. Cassie became a constant presence in my life from that moment on. Ezra told me it was hard for him to cut contact with her because their families were so close, so I tried to understand. It didn't matter that she clung to his arm at every event or called him by every affectionate nickname in the book. We'd come home to our apartment because it quickly became our shared home, and he'd tell me he loved me, and I believed him. He simply didn't want to hurt his family by cutting Cassie out. I mean, how could I complain when I loved my own family with all my heart? I would do anything for them, so I could understand that he wanted to protect his mother's feelings. 8 months into our relationship, he proposed to me. I now know he did it the same day he found out that Cassie had a new boyfriend. At the time, though, I was blinded by love and happily accepted, even though there was no ring. I thought he wanted to propose so much that he couldn't wait to get one. A year later, I was walking down the aisle, happy to marry him. Back then, I thought my wedding to Ezra would be the best day of my life. I hadn't seen my family in months, and suddenly they were all in the same room celebrating my husband and me. I was so excited to catch up with them and introduce them, considering that until that point, the only family member of mine Ezra had met was my stepbrother, who had visited me a few months earlier. I didn't even care that Cassie showed up in a white dress or danced almost as much with him as I did. Afterward, I excused it, thinking that Ezra was just celebrating this special day with his lifelong friend. That's what I did throughout my entire marriage to him. I ignored the warning signs and justified his actions, especially when it came to Cassie. But that should have been a huge red flag. For 2 years, I made excuses every time Ezra prioritized his ex-girlfriend, whom he privately called obsessive and crazy among other insults, when no one else could hear. I ignored every time his mother compared me to Cassie. I turned the other cheek every time Cassie made a snide remark disguised as a joke or helpful advice. At the end of the day, Ezra was all I had. All the friendships I had made in that city were related to him, or us as a couple, and every family connection I had was through him. My family lived in another state, hours away, and Ezra was never willing to make that trip. He was all I had. Then I got pregnant. To clarify, there was no abuse or anything like that in a way that would have been easier to explain to my family and friends. What finally made me open my eyes and realize how much Cassie influenced his life was the fact that he truly believed I was pregnant with my stepbrother's child. Take a moment to process how absurd that is. Ezra genuinely thought the baby I was carrying wasn't his, but that I had cheated on him with Sebastian, my stepbrother. Since I lived in another city far from home, and our relationship before marriage hadn't been that long, Sebastian and Ezra had only met once before the wedding when Sebastian visited me early in the relationship. The second time they met was at our wedding, a year and a half after we got married. A month later, I found out I was pregnant. I thought Ezra would be happy. He had always talked about wanting a big family with lots of children, and we had friends and family ready to support us. But instead of being happy, the first thing he said was, "She said this would happen." It's been almost 10 years, and I still remember it with total clarity. I was completely confused. The only explanation he gave me was, "She warned me, and I should have believed her." Instead of being happy, he left the apartment that same night and didn't answer any of my calls or messages. When he returned the next morning, he gave me two options: abortion or divorced. To save you the details, when I finally managed to get him to explain what was happening, it turned out that Cassie had been filling his head with lies. Apparently, during our wedding, she convinced him that Sebastian and I were behaving inappropriately for step-siblings, that we were too close, too affectionate. According to her, the way we hugged, how we posed in family photos, and how we spent time together at the reception were too intimate, almost romantic. She even told him that I had likely moved to our city because I was heartbroken after Sebastian got a girlfriend. After our wedding, Cassie spent months filling Ezra's head with lies about Sebastian and me. All she had were small fragments of our relationship that she saw on social media, since Sebastian lived in another state. But that didn't stop her. Then, when I traveled alone to see him and came back pregnant, that was all she needed to convince Ezra I was cheating. Naturally, I denied everything. None of the accusations Ezra believed because of Cassie were true. Sebastian was practically like a twin brother to me. The accusation was not only absurd, but deeply offensive. But Ezra didn't care. He didn't care when I offered to take a paternity test. He didn't care when I showed him the medical reports indicating that I was already pregnant before I traveled. He didn't even care when I broke down in front of him, begging him to come to his senses. It was a tough blow, but I couldn't ignore it. I packed my bags, requested a transfer at work, and went back home to my real family. All things considered, the divorce was relatively simple. Ezra's mother had insisted on signing a prenuptial agreement, and the lack of shared assets made the process quick. Ezra also refused any paternity test, and thus signed a document relinquishing any rights to our unborn child. I hadn't heard from him since then, and now I find out he's looking for me and our son. My concerns are as follows. My current husband, Grant, knows very little about Ezra's manipulative behavior toward me. He knows I was married before, but I've only ever told him about the worst parts of that relationship, Ezra's infidelity and the divorce. The fact that I never shared the full extent of what Ezra and Cassie did to me in the past makes me nervous. I don't want to bring up painful memories, but I also feel that Grant deserves to know the truth about why Ezra might suddenly appear in our lives again. If Ezra is now trying to reach out to me after all these years, I don't want him anywhere near my child, especially after the emotional abuse he put me through. The only reason I ever agreed to let him meet my child is for him to realize that there's no connection between me and Sebastian. Otherwise, there's no reason for him to be involved in our lives. I just don't know what to do. Should I protect my current family from this?